We're drawing the Arc du Carrousel in the Tuileries Gardens in Paris. It's probably my favourite French arch. I think it's a very beautiful and elegant structure with its different coloured marbles. So we're looking at it from a fairly steep angle, side on, looking across the front with its 4 columns on one side and 4 columns on the other side, of which we can only see one. We have a fair amount of foliage around it, which I think makes a lovely contrast to the lines of the marble. It has a number of challenges, not least being the sculptures that adorn the tops of each of the pillars and the figures and the horses and the chariots on the top. So at this point, I start with this first and closest column, and I use that as my means of establishing proportion, and then as a reference for what else I draw. And I draw the other columns going off to the right. Just looking at this, my perspective angle could have been a little steeper as it moved from left to right. It could have sloped down just a little bit more. Now, with the top of the arch towards the left, I slope it down, I think, too much to the left, and I spend a fair bit of the drawing continually making adjustments and just trying to make it a little more level, a little less slanted down towards the left. And I do that a number of ways, by lifting some lines on the left hand side of the top of the arch, and by lowering lines on the other side. So just keep a look out for when I do that, because all the way through I take every opportunity to lift it a little bit, and the challenge is to do it without making it look such a mess that it just draws attention to itself. Now, it's actually quite a complicated structure because we've got these entablatures that come out over the top of each column and really form part of the base for the 4 Napoleonic soldiers who stand on top. So even all these lines I've just drawn now, the ones with the dots between them, I need to try and lift those slightly, I decide, as I keep drawing. There is this beautiful band of darker red marble that goes around the top, just under the cornice that overhangs so beautifully. That is also an opportunity to add some hatching and to re-establish a slightly different emphasis with the angle of my lines here. So now I'm trying to work out the section on the very top. I'm really looking at the proportions of the boxes, the rectangles I want to end up with, and working out where to put the lines in that way. It was a bit tricky to work out this angle of the very top because it sits behind these statues, and I really wanted to make sure the statues clearly visually were in front. So I didn't want to draw it, but then I also had to kind of reference the statues off it as well. In the end, I basically looked on my reference where the head of each statue was in relation to the first statue I drew, and that's how I positioned it. I find that's much more accurate than as we work along with a series such as this to simply reference off the one before, because then small errors can creep in bit by bit. But if we continually reference off the first of the series, I find that gives us a much higher level of accuracy. So I'm doing some of these figures. Now, figures, sculptural figures, it can be a real challenge in architecture, but a lot of the most beautiful and tempting architecture to draw does have them. So it's helpful to work out a technique of representing architectural figure sculptures. Now, I've got a few videos on that which I think are really very helpful, that explain my process in detail. But again, it's about finding the key form that we want to emphasize, that will let the brain create what it wants to see. I realize now that I've put that line in along the face of the arch, accurate to the drawing, but not accurate to where the tops of the columns are, because they haven't come down steeply enough. Okay, well that line I've just added helps a bit, because that actually feels like it pulls it down a little bit, even though I haven't really really. And I just realized that the center arch actually is between columns 2 and 3. It would have been easy without looking to stick the larger arch between columns 3 and 4, which is obviously where it is. But from this angle, it's actually visible behind the second and third columns. Now, this is where I'm endlessly just making little adjustments here, trying to shift the impact. And I think I do manage to just drop it a little bit. Yep, I could have done that better the first time there. And I think generally it works better than it was looking in the very early stages. Fortunately, there is a fair bit of fuss, a fair bit of line work in that central band that runs around the very top of the archway and beneath the base for the statues. And so that lets me put more lines there than I could perhaps have got away with ordinarily. Now, there's this lovely dark foliage on the left-hand side, which I'm also using just to establish more clearly exactly which lines are the column and which lines aren't. And then I have this tree here in the foreground, and it's an important tree to do, and it also balances the tree on the far side of the arch. So it is good to get that in place. And I'm trying to capture something of the actual growth habit of this tree. Always try and do that. It's great practice for drawing trees, but yeah, always resist drawing a generic tree because they're not usually very convincing, and we need to increase our skills for observing a particular reference and capturing the effect of that using our line in some way. And so this could almost be a video on drawing a tree, I suspect. And notice how I kind of preserved some of the silhouette of that closer tree. When I did the further back tree, I in the sense hatched the negative space by using the shade and shadow of the tree behind to create that. Now on the far side, I want to keep this with a lighter touch because I wanted to stay back at the other end. And look how little line work, how few marks I use to put in that tree further back. But because I've been able to use the hedge that sits behind it, I've been able to define the tree really, I think, quite nicely. And I think it just works very beautifully as a compositional element. Looking at this, I think my columns are a little bit too spaced. I think my arch comes out from the first column to the fourth column just a little bit too much. I think the whole arch should really sit more between the first 3 columns in terms of space. But I don't know that it will be so obvious when I take away the reference photo. And now I just have the quadriga on top, the 4 horses. It's really important to try and capture the sense of these 4 horses without too many lines. So you can have a look at the lines I've done. Now I just made that column too narrow. But yep, I couldn't do anything about that, so I just pretended I hadn't done it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it helpful. And why not give it a go? It's such an interesting structure, the Arc du Carrousel in the Tuileries in Paris. But look, whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.